Another key part of strategic practice is managing constraints. There's always this wonderful thing where people come along and say, I've got a great proposal that's going on, but it's not going to work because until the government changes. For me, that is not a good proposal, waiting till the government change. There are two kinds of constraints to think about when we're managing constraints in order to get our work done. There are constraints that are usually a context for our work that have to be changed over the longer term. They may be institutional, financial, technical, political, environmental, all kinds of constraints. And there are some constraints that are actually a barrier to our work that have to be removed in order to get anything started. The way in which we manage those is instrumental. And I found in participatory work that working with people, it's fantastic how they can open doors that you cannot open from outside. Again, the importance of engaging with experts who know. Going to scale, scaling up projects is another strategic aspect of practice. Yeah? And not just scaling up in size, but scaling up ideas, scaling up methods as such, scaling up the impact of work and so on. And finally, insofar as being strategic in practice, learning. We are not very good learners. I love it when people say lessons learned. Lessons are not learned in terms of work unless they change the way you think, do, and organize the next time round. And I have a lovely diagram which shows that when you think that these things are going to have to change next time, you redefine the problem to fit the way you already work, because you don't want to change your organization. You've built up your reputation, you've built up your job creativity based on the way that you work. And now, because of what you've learned, you have to change that? No. So we redefine the problem in order to get our own work accepted. So that's all about ensuring, thinking again about the purpose and scope of practice. We have to redefine what it's all about, which means all of those things that we're talking about. The second issue to talk about is about the life and organization of place, recognizing the intelligence of what I call the intelligence of informality, which we find in the streets of everywhere. How do we build on this? Not how do we negate it, but how do we caption it? We need to recognize the need for at least two levels of organization, two levels of structure, which always coexist as such. There are emergent structures and there are design structures. Emergent structures are very interesting. There was a piece of research done in the United States some years ago between MIT and the Sloan Kettering Institute, which is a hospital in New York. And I don't know how it came, I don't know the background of it, but they were studying the organic matter of the slime mold. The slime mold, as some of you may have seen it, is this sort of grey matter that you sometimes find on apple trees. Yeah? And they were trying to understand the behavior of the cellular structure of the slime mold. And they thought that the slime mold had a brain because it always used to move together, either a brain or a leader. So they made a maze, kind of one of these things, and they put some food at one end to see how the slime mold moved. And sure, after a few days, it found the food. So again, this must be a leader. Somebody must be saying yes. After a while, though, they could not find, after all the research, they could not find the leading cell, nor could they find anything to do with an organizational structure of its brain that suggested it had an intelligence. What they did find is that they were the cells, individual cells became a collective in search of a common cause. And that was really interesting. And many people have actually argued that the informal sectors that we look at are very much like the slime mold. I hate to kind of use that terminology, but they are emergent structures, structures that emerge as a result of need. Emergent structures, emergent organizations are small, they're self-organizing, they're creative, they're flexible. This is the definition of being ingenious, which I found very interesting. An inclination to work with the resources at hand, a knack for combining these resources in surprising ways, and doing it all in a way which is practical. Now, my view is most of the informal sectors work like this, so they are ingenious as such. So in other words, emergent structures are self-organizing, and they're very creative. But cities, human society, also need design structures, physical, spatial, legal, institutional, with rules, standards, routines, with rituals, which provide continuity and stability. They provide a shared context of meaning, a shared context of purpose, a shared, if you like, sense of place. That's what, we share together as such. So there is a need for design structures. And it was Isaiah Berlin who said many years ago that it is to these structures we give up some of our liberties in order to protect the rest. And that was interesting. So how much structure do you design before it's too much? How much liberty are you prepared to give up individually in order to protect the rest? Becomes a really interesting balance. So how much do you design, how much not? Knowing that not enough structure is unhelpful, it leaves too much to discretion, it can lead to chaos, even conflict, and yet too much structure is inhibiting, it makes the world look much neater than it really is. We see it in our public housing, in our master plans, all that stuff. It locks you into systems which are top-heavy with rules, regulations, standards to which you have to comply. Ensuring compliance becomes the real purpose of practice. When compliance to systems takes precedent over attention to people, systems become self-serving. And lots of examples of that. I mean, there's wonderful examples where people say, universities would work really well if only we could get rid of the students. Hospitals would be fantastic without the patients. The best example that was done some years ago by the Confederation of British Industries in response to complaints from customers who would stand at bus stops and they would try and stop the buses and the buses would not stop. They'd just go straight by. So they did a survey amongst the bus drivers, said, why don't the buses stop at bus stops? And today it's the same thing. We risk your life to stop the buses. And the resounding conclusion from the bus drivers was, how can we stick to timetables if we have to keep stopping for passengers? Complete nonsense. The purpose, systems become self-serving. The purpose is lost as such. And I call it my PEAS principles. PEAS, providing, enabling, adapting, sustaining. I'm thinking of turning PEAS into pairs because there's a new word in the business called resilience. So PEARS, but maybe that's not a good idea. In my book, Housing Without Houses, which was mentioned earlier, I argued that we needed to stop being providers of housing, of water, of sanitation, and instead become enablers. And I've since changed my position a little bit, because whatever we do, however we do it, there's always stuff that has to be provided. No getting away from it. But how can you decide what to provide unless you sort out what it is it's trying to enable? Yep. Providing on its own is all about lowest common denominator, which I mentioned before. It's about averages. If you just provide housing for the majority, well, it's all about averages, standards, and so on. Providing on its own is all about standards, common denominators. People become dependent on having everything provided for them. Creativity becomes the mandate of the elite and the gifted. Power relations are often reinforced. All of those issues come to bear, and we know that. We've studied that. Providing sometimes becomes as charity, and I have nothing against charity, although many people will argue that charity induces a moral superiority amongst the charitable, more so than actually providing good for those who are the charity is directed. In any case, whether it's good or bad, it's not sustainable. Neither charity nor providing from the top down is sustainable in its own right. So we have to then consider, what is it that I should provide in order to enable? So the second issue is enablement. And enablement is interesting because it again induces very different relationships. There's community enablement, which is about capacities, it's about organization. There's political enablement, which is about standards, about removing discrimination. Market enablement, which is about partnerships, social enterprises, and the rest. And there's design enablement, which is the one that I become interested in. And that's where I said I would come back to my interest in design, but not as a process just of creating city form or the form and spatial form of buildings, but also as a process of enablement. Design as a process of enablement, cultivating an environment of choice, cultivating an environment of opportunity. It's very interesting that when I was taught as an architect, I had all these variables, I would reduce them down to a set of parameters, and I would provide a solution. Design as a process of enablement increases the choice, looks at options and trade-offs. You can go in different ways to produce different solutions. In Sri Lanka, this was reflected in what we called the housing options and loans package. There wasn't a single solution that would fit all. Yeah? Cultivating an environment of choice, that's design as a process of enablement. encouraging, not discouraging, improvisation in search of order, the kind of order that liberates the resourcefulness of others rather than confines it to second best, based on difference, not on sameness. Design is a process of enablement, mediates power relations, it explores new relationships between things, between people and things, and between all and the environment. All of which places architects, artists, planners, I don't care who you are, in a different and profoundly social relationship to people and place. How does that feature in our work as such? The third part of our responsibilities is the A, which is all about adaptation. It's interesting, we very rarely think about that. And I would like to argue right from now that actually, anything to be sustainable, it has to be adaptable. It has to be able to change in order to continue to be relevant in its fit between people and changed circumstances. Adapt or change accepts that places grow, accepts that they change in order to sustain good fit between people and place. It's additive, it's incremental, you can call it what you like. In order to change to fit, how do you make places fit for change? That becomes another level in which we have to reflect back on whether we provided too much structure, not enough structure, does it have clarity, is it inclusive? Again, revisiting what we provide and what it is trying to enable. Colin Ward talked about the infinite variability of the vernacular when he talked about adaptation. Look at the way the vernacular in all our environments changes progressively, incrementally, and so on. He talks about improvisation as being, in fact it was, I think, Richard Sennett who talked about improvisation as being the user's art, which is, I think, a lovely definition of what it is. It recognized the important relation between the individual and the collective. They have rules, usually set by the limits of resources, etc., but they can combine those in a flexible way to meet needs on a progressively changing basis. Key in this respect, I've always found very interesting of looking at some theoretical background, this is my academic background. Simon Nicholson was a guy who had what he called the theory of loose parts, and it was actually directed at play for children. And he said that in any environment, both the degree of inventiveness and creativity and the possibilities for discovery are directly proportional to the number of kinds of variables in it. You know, what is variable? And I find very interesting in terms of play now. There are playgrounds that come as do-it-yourself packs, like IKEA packs, where the children actually put the playground together themselves, and the next group will change it. Fascinating. In New York, some of them are being invented, rather than these play areas that are fixed. Again, look at our built environment. How much of it is actually fixed, untouchable, regulated, and how much of it is improvisable as such? How do we invite change in order to create an architecture of opportunity, an architecture of invitation, and not just an architecture of form? Yeah? How should we design in order to liberate rather than confine all this ingenuity and resourcefulness that we find in places such as the kind that we talked about before? The S is all about sustainability, all right? And again, as I said, the key and the core to sustainability is the opportunity and the ability of environment to adapt. I like to, when I do my field work in different countries, I like to collect shop signs because they tell a lot about what's happening in the place. So there was this wonderful sign, I was working in one of the townships in South Africa, that went, head shine and shoe shine, we work at both ends. Great idea, you have your hair cut and your shoes polished at the same time, fantastic. There was another one that said, Wally the Undertaker, you know the Undertaker, the guys who bury things. Wally the Undertaker, we're the last to let you down. Fantastic, creative, informal sector. But the one that stopped us, which was interesting, was the sustainable barber shop, the haircutting shop. And we said, we have to stop and talk to these guys. Yeah? And it was just after the removal of apartheid in South Africa, and they had all kinds of programs of sustainability, all these words were being used. And the haircutter, the barber, had never actually been asked what a sustainable barber shop really is. So we said, what does this say? And he thought for a minute, he thought very hard. And then he said, a sustainable barber shop, well, when my customers come in, I cut just enough hair so that they're satisfied, but not too much so they come back sooner rather than later. And I thought that's a great definition of sustainability. This guy was not interested in saving the world. He wanted to save his business, to keep things going. Three things for me are key in thinking about sustainability and, for that matter, resilience: ownership, organization, and asset accumulation. When I say asset accumulation, I'm talking about tangible and intangible assets. Tangible is the house, the money, the equipment, fine. But the intangible assets, those network of alliances, that cultural identity, your sense of belonging, these are all intangible assets that are at the key of our work, which goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning. Let me end with a dilemma that I've faced, and many of my students and colleagues still face, but it goes back to this issue of rigor and relevance. When I was teaching at MIT, I had a colleague, Don Schoen, who wrote a wonderful book called The Reflective Practitioner. He wrote a book. In the geography of professional practice, there's a very dry, high ground where you can practice the techniques and use the theories on which you got your PhD. Down below, there's the swamp where the real problems lie. The difficulty is to decide whether to stay on the high ground, where you can be rigorous but deal with problems of much lesser importance, or go down in the swamp to work on problems you really care about, but in a way in which you see as hopelessly unrigorous. It's a dilemma of rigor or relevance. You can't have both, and the way in which people choose between them sets the course of their professional lives. One consequence is that professionals who stick to the high ground become not only separate from practice, but increasingly divergent from it. Now, I've been thinking about that, and it's a dilemma we all face, rigor and relevance. And I slightly have reoriented it. Don't entirely agree with Don Schoen. I like to put it slightly differently. The question for me is how to be rigorous to your discipline as designers, economists, planners, but in ways that are relevant to the issues which we face today, which, as I say, we can no longer write off as somebody else's problem. Thank you very much.